An experiment results in one of the following sample points, E1, E2, E3, E4, and E5. And we're supposed to find probabilities of these certain results happening. Now this might look harder than it truly is. Each of these probabilities or results, E1, E2, E3, E4, and E5, are simply sample spaces, sample points in this experiment. So we have 5 sample points. And the key thing to remember is that probabilities must add to 1. Okay, so let's get started. Question A says find the probability of E3 if the probability of E1 is 0.1 and so on and so forth. Well, if we know all of these probabilities have to add together, in general, we would know that the probability of E1 plus the probability of E2 and so on, probability of E3, E4 plus the probability of E5 has to equal 1. Well, E1 is 0.1, E2 is 0.2, E4 is 0.1, E5 is 0.1, and then we're just left with this E3 event or experimental result that we don't know the probability of E3. All of this adds to 1. So we have 1.1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plus the probability of E3 has to equal 1. Subtracting 0.5 from both sides, I see that the probability of E3 has to equal 0.5. And that's your answer. Now for part B, similar pattern except for we're finding the probability of E3. We have this odd condition that the probability of E1 equals the probability of E3. But we'll go through this the same way. Probability of E2 is 0.1. The probability of E4 is 0.2. Probability of E5 is 0.1. And then we have this probability of E1 and the probability of E3. All this has to add to 1. So, adding our numbers together, we say 0.4 plus the probability of E1 and the probability of E3 must equal 1. Taking that 0.4 away from both sides, I see that the probability of E1 plus the probability of E3 has to equal 0.6. Well, now remember E3 and E1 have that same chance of happening, so I could say that if each are equally likely, then we have to take half of 0.6, so that would be 0.3 plus 0.3, that equal chance. Mathematically, I could say twice the probability of either of them. The probability of, we'll say, E3 has to equal 0.6. But I think you could reason it out to see that the probability of E3 has to equal 0.3. And our final question here, find the probability of E3 if probability of E1, E2, E4, and E5 are all 0.1. Well, that means we have 0.1 plus 0.1 plus 0.1 plus 0.1 plus the probability of E3 has to equal 1. Well, that's 0.4 plus the probability of E3 equals 1. Subtract 0.4 from both sides. I see the probability of E3 equals 0.6.